Testing, testing, 1, 2, 3. Testing, 1, 2, 3.
Okay, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to Penang Institute. For those who are here for the first time, for those here for the first time, welcome to Penang Institute. And for those who have been here, welcome back. Welcome back to Penang Institute. Welcome to tonight's book talk, which is entitled The Great Port Cities of Asia, A Writer's Journey. Our speaker tonight is Kennie Ting, the former director of the Asian Civilizations Museum and Peranakan Museum in Singapore. Kennie has been described as a writer and storyteller at heart, with a passion for the heritage and material culture of Asian port cities. Over his 8-year tenure as museum director, Kennie is credited for making the Asian Civilizations Museum more relevant to Singapore's heritage and context. Kennie has transformed the Asian Civilizations Museum from an ethnographically and geographically themed museum to one with a cross-cultural and global outlook centered on the port city's narrative. During this time, he also expanded the museum's collecting and curatorial scope to include works of contemporary photography, fashion, and design. Kennie is the author of The Romance of the Grand Tour, 100 Years of Travel in Southeast Asia, Singapore Chronicles Heritage, Singapore 1819, A Living Legacy, and most recently, this book that is the subject of tonight's event program, The Great Port Cities of Asia in History. Tonight, we join Kennie as he takes an epic journey across maritime Asia and the Indian Ocean and shares the journey of travel, research, and writing behind his new book. The moderator for tonight's proceedings is Bettina Chua Abdullah. Bettina is writer and director of Hikayat. Without further ado, may I call on Kennie to take the stage for his talk, The Great Port Cities of Asia, A Writer's Journey.
Good evening. Okay, it works. Thank you so very much. Philip, my friend just said, thank you so very much, first of all, to the Penang Institute, Fawaz and the wonderful team here for this evening's event. Thank you to Gareth and Garak Budaya Bookshop in Penang for having me. Thanks to Bettina for the difficult questions you're going to pose me later. And last but not least, thank you so much to the fabulous and lovely Digna, to Neo, and also to Natalie for making this happen in the first place, and for the amazing hospitality. Penang is not the same without you guys. It's been a wonderful time being here. So thank you so much for making this such a beautiful moment for me. I'm supposed to talk a little bit about my journey as a writer and as I suppose an enthusiast for the subject of the cosmopolitan Asian port city. The one thing I want to start with is how wonderful it is for me to be here in Penang. So between 2016 and between 2012 and 2017, I actually traveled to more than 40 port as well as imperial cities across Asia to photograph a lot of the city's sort of historic architecture. For some reason, I was just very obsessed by it, and every month, I would go to a city, and I only stopped doing this when I got the museum job because I didn't have any time anymore from 2017. So the wonderful thing is that the very first city that got me on this journey, gosh, it's not working. Hang on. Is Penang. Yeah, so it's wonderful to be back here. I was actually here because I came to attend a friend's wedding, but I was so rude I skipped the wedding and instead I was like staying at the E&O, you know, like I love these sort of grand heritage hotels. I skipped the wedding and I walked about the city with my camera shooting these historic streetscapes. So I went to this space yesterday just to see if it was still there. So it's no longer a boutique. This is 12 years ago, mind you, May 2012. And it's no longer that, although the decor, the colors, you know, are still on the building. And then this was May 2012. And when I did my sort of rounds here in Penang shooting the buildings and the streetscapes, I decided that I really loved doing that. So I kept going. So every month I would, because I started work already, right? So every month I would go to another city in Southeast Asia. The next city I went to was Manila to shoot and to walk the streets. And the first 12 cities ended up in this book. I shipped around a proposal for the book to many publishers in Singapore. And finally, my publisher, Talisman, they're the publishing imprint of APD Singapore, picked the book up. This wasn't the book that I shipped around. The book that I shipped around was a little more serious. It looked at exploring, exploring sort of colonial architecture in Southeast Asia, but the publisher advised that a book such as this, which was about the history of luxury travel, sort of steamships, grand hotels, historical architecture would sell better. So I went this way. So that's the first book of this sort of port city trilogy. And then somehow or other, very soon after the book coming out in 2015, I had another book out at the time as well about Singapore, which is not here. I landed a side hustle as the director of the Asian Civilizations Museum and the Peranakan Museum, which is a department of the ACM, so it's the exact same team. And it was actually very timely because the museum itself was shifting its approach towards looking at networks and flows, a spotlight on port cities as well, on these themes of trade and the spread of faith in peoples and culture and so on. So I brought, in some ways, my love of the cities, these cities to the museum, but the museum itself also, of course, rubbed off on me in terms of how I would use objects in the museum to tell stories about the past. So I've always been working on some book or another, even when I took over the museum. So around that time, I was working on the second book. This is a book about Singapore heritage, various aspects of heritage, whether it's built heritage or intangible cultural heritage or objects in the museum, or flora and fauna, but I wanted it to be an exploration of heritage from a port city perspective. In Singapore, I'm not sure if it's like that here, but there tends to be sometimes very, because we're an island nations, there's an insular way of looking at heritage, you know? There's like, okay, this is heritage, and you stop short of exploring how and where the heritage got here. So the museum, the art historical perspective is to look at these sorts of aspects and to see, you know, whether it's in terms of aesthetics, materials, to explore the roots of these aspects of heritage from elsewhere. So I'll give you an example. One of the things I did in this book was to look at this very famous portrait of Sir Stamford Raffles that is in the National Museum. The original hangs in the National Portrait Gallery in London, and is often used to just kind of tell the history of Singapore. But what it is a Regency era style portrait. And the Regency era style portraits have a very specific purpose. They're meant to sort of celebrate a particular milestone in the career of a very important person. So in that way, I try to sort of look at very familiar aspects of heritage and to explore the art historical aspects of it. Where did this come from? Therefore, what are these links to the rest of the world? So that book came out in 2019, and then I started working in 2020 on this book, which is a kind of sequel to the Singapore book, but also I like to call this the kind of culmination of a port city trilogy. So the Singapore book was a kind of outside-in look at heritage. This is an inside-out look at Asia. So I tried really to kind of examine and recast Asian kind of history, art, culture from the perspective of Singapore being kind of a cosmopolitan port city, but could also be Penang, basically. It's just how, if we looked at Asian history from the perspective of us being a port city, how different would it look like? And so why should you buy this book? Okay, I've been trained by my publisher as well for a few reasons. First of all, it's multidisciplinary. So I really tried to provide a very rich form, rich avenues of storytelling by way of using literature, travel writing in particular. I look at architecture and monuments. Of course, I use museums and works of art as starting points. There's fashion and photography. There's food, very important. Although a lot of the food bits got cut out. I'll talk about it later. I had to cut huge chunks of the book out in order to keep it, in a size that won't break your wrist. So people in popular culture and so on. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about, so I say, all these, I use these very serious terms that I gleaned from the museum: global Asia, multidisciplinary, inclusive, cross-cultural, decolonized. What does this mean? So I said this already, that I think what I tried to do was really to kind of retell the story of Asia. When you are, and this was something that we were going through at the museum as well. Typically, when you think about Asia and its history and its art history, it's always in terms of empires, right? So it's like the Song Yuan Ming Qing, and then you have sort of like you have the Delhi Sultanate and the Mughals and so on, and you have the Khmer. So it's always about empires, and port cities tend to be at the periphery. But what if actually, what if we looked at the history of Asia from these sort of spaces in the periphery? Which my main argument being that these peripheral spaces were actually very important because of the change that they brought. So it's a kind of a new dare I say, new history of Asia, a very different view of Asia that is globalized, that's not sort of like insular. And then secondly, I reference a lot of research on each of these port cities in multiple fields. A lot of it's actually very obscure because I try to find and feature all these port cities that you may not remember so readily. And I try to make sure that these sorts of new ideas that have been espoused by many of the the best thinkers in the fields are actually accessible to the average or the mainstream audience. I'm very interested in people as well. So you see that there is I paint a very rich tapestry of the various kinds of port city communities across the Indian Ocean and Asia, but also the emergence of these cross-cultural or hybrid or Creole or whatever term you want to use, these hybrid communities in port cities, like the Peranakan communities, like Eurasians, like the Goans and so on. And finally, and most importantly, again, because this is something that we are all as museums of Asian art grappling with, this very heavy, kind of very loaded term of decolonization. We're all grappling with this. So this was also my way of finding ways to sort of how to defamiliarize these very traditional narratives that are colonial. When you think about trade, it's always the Europeans or the East India companies coming here. But I thought it was very important to balance that out. So I'm not necessarily repudiating that, but to provide a fuller picture, the fact that there was still Asian trade happening, even as the Europeans were here. And if we shift the timeline back a couple of hundreds of years, you'll find that there was a lot of there was a very rich narrative of trade happening before the East Asian companies came. Okay, so my publisher reminds me that this is not an academic book. We have long arguments about how I have to make sure that it's actually readable, etc. But if there is a thesis, and this doesn't appear in this form in the introduction, but it's kind of the main point, which is that I try to argue that port cities are actually very, very important because they are, a space where cultures come together and come into contact and encounter, and they mix. And because of this mixing, there are new forms of new ways of living, new forms of creativity that emerge. And oftentimes also you see that it's through these port cities that new ideas, whether it's in terms of technology, society, governance and politics, etc., were then sort of imported into the larger mainland. Okay, so basically I'm crazy, so I decided that we had to have an epic scope for this book. So it takes in 60 port cities, 2,000 years of history, basically. And I cheat, you know, I'm not satisfied with just being geographically in Asia, but I cheat and include a couple of cities in Africa. So the Swahili coast, because of the, you know, there's a strong kind of Asian kind of influence there, but also Cape Town. It's very important kind of like threshold. So it used to be that once you crossed Cape Town, you've basically come into the literal world of the Indian Ocean, and it was a different world. So yeah, 6 sections, 42 chapters. How do you actually read this book? So I wrote it such that you can actually pick whatever chapter you want, whatever port, and start from there. You don't have to start from the beginning and read it to the end. Just pick whatever you like and go from there, dip in and out, etc. But if you do read it from the beginning to end, you will see that everything's interconnected, which is the point of these port cities. You see that there are certain themes that I willfully, or certain terms that I willfully don't actually introduce, you know, that would have been of use at the beginning, but I only introduce them at the end. So, you know, these sort of leitmotifs, so to speak, that and characters that recur throughout the book. So I did not write this to be a history book. What I was really inspired by is Ibn Battuta's Rihla. The travel writing features very heavily in the book, as well as the figure of these kind of wanderers. So I kind of fancied myself a kind of latter-day wanderer, just basically trying to wander through space and time. And in each of these port cities, I try to provide a window onto how life was in these cities, to give you a sense of how the city would have looked and felt, and how people would have dressed, how people would have looked like. The next kind of few slides, I'm just going to give you a sense of an overview of the book in general. There are 6 sections to the book, and each of these 6 sections, I actually explore 2 or 3 very specific themes. So I'll give you a sense of the thinking behind each of these sections. So the first section of sailors and shipwrecks takes place and features these very ancient port cities. Of course, it's very difficult to give you a sense of how they look like, because so much of the cities don't exist anymore. I mean, in the places today. So I had to seek recourse in archaeology, particularly archaeology, but also in literature. So in terms of archaeology, one particular collection that features very strongly is the Tang shipwreck in Singapore. For those of you who don't know this, it's a 9th century wreck that was made in China, but the cargo was made in China, but it was carried by a vessel that was a Middle Eastern, made in the Middle East, and it sunk off Sumatra, and we have it in Singapore. And it links together the stories of 3 big cities: Basra, which is a very important port in the day, even though today you don't think of Iraq as, you know, being a sort of splendid, sort of cosmopolitan kind of port city, but it was very important. Yangzhou in China, and Palembang, the capital of the Srivijaya Empire. There's also other archaeology in there. So for example, I also explore the movement of the Hindu-Buddhist faith across from India to Southeast Asia. So there's the first piece you encounter in the book, for example, is a piece from the Bujang Valley in Kedah that we have in the ACM's collection. And of course, literature features as well. So the image to the left is from a 1914 illustration of Sinbad the Sailor and the Arabian Nights. So Sinbad the Sailor features I have Tang poetry to give you a sense of how life was like, but also surprisingly for Sinbad the Sailor, there's a sense of how these ships, like the Bellytong ship, could have been commissioned and sailed by merchants. And Sinbad the Sailor famously sailed from Basra in each of his like 7 voyages. Part 2 is actually my favorite part. It looks at the pre-colonial period where the Indian Ocean was quote unquote a Muslim lake. And so I explored I give you a sense of like who were these merchants. And they were actually multi-religious and multicultural. They weren't just Muslims per se. They were the Hindu Banyan. They were these Jewish merchants, so it was a very kind of multicultural milieu that was trading across the Indian Ocean at the time. The image to the left is the tomb of the Malik al-Tujjar, the king of the merchants in Cambay. And this tomb and his death was featured in Ibn Battuta's 14th century Rihla. So merchants is one theme, and then I also explore these incursions, these foreign incursions into the Indian Ocean world. The first were the Chinese with Cheng Ho, Admiral Cheng Ho. This is a very famous painting of the giraffe that was presented at the Yongle, the Emperor Yongle's imperial courts in Nanjing, and it was brought back by Cheng Ho's one of Cheng Ho's voyages, and it was referred to here in this painting as a qilin, a kirin, which is a sort of a harbinger of it was proof that the emperor or the emperor would have a long and prosperous reign. The second incursion were the Portuguese. The Portuguese came into the space and they came to Malacca and they changed the landscape of the Indian Ocean world forever. So at the time, the Indian Ocean world was a kind of free and easy, laissez-faire sort of place that you kind of traded. There was no one port or area that was necessarily more important than another. But the Portuguese came and trying to exert a kind of monopoly onto trade in this area. So what's very important in this section is that there was a triumvirate of port cities that were the most important at the time. So it was Cambay in Gujarat, Aden in Arabia, and Malacca. And when the Portuguese came, that sort of was broken up a little bit. So part 3 of Spices and Companies, we explored the East Asian companies as well as the spice trade. And of course, you have the usual suspects up here, like Goa and Batavia and Manila and Nagasaki. We have the Portuguese Estado da India, the Dutch East India Company, etc. But what's missing? So it's not on this page, but it's in history. You've always there are things that don't appear. So I tried to make sure that we also included in the book these port cities that were still in Asian hands and that were actually facilitating intra-Asian trade, even when the Europeans were here. So there was Ayutthaya in Thailand, Hoi An in Vietnam, Mocha in the Arabian Peninsula, Surat in Gujarat, and so on and so forth. Really to sort of make a point that, we're so familiar with these narratives of the East India companies coming in, but the fact is that the Portuguese, maybe the Dutch, but the Portuguese, for example, the Spanish, they did not succeed in exerting monopoly. These Muslim traders, at this time it was the Gujarati traders, were still plying their trade. And there were also the other Asian empires that were in this space. The Ottoman Empire, very important, the Mughal Empire, and Aceh. Part 4 was the age of empire. So of course we have Calcutta and the British Raj, with Hong Kong, the Opium War, and the stories of the treaty ports in China and Japan. But again, I felt that it was very important to also sort of balance these slightly more familiar narratives with stories of ports that we may have forgotten about. So here's where I had a story of Aceh and how it resisted the Dutch or the East European companies for 200 years, how it was run by these amazing queens. And when the Europeans came, it was always queens in Aceh. So they thought that Aceh had always been run by queens. The Bugis in Makassar, how they emerged to become one of the most important kind of seafaring peoples in this part of the world. They were known as pirates, but that's probably a kind of European point of view, because when you resist you were just called pirates, basically. And then we move into the late 19th century. And for this section, section 5, I explored the theme of modernity. What did modernity mean for these various port cities? The starting point of this section is the Suez Canal and how it opened and the advent of steamship travel, new kinds of new networks of communication and travel. And well, yes, they introduced sort of like new ways for people to sort of travel long distance, but they were also took place kind of hand in hand with the expansion of empire. So tourism always went in some ways with the expansion of empire. But then I'm also interested in sort of, you know, modernity in terms of new ways of living. So here we have the Shanghai girl, like the Singapore girl, and these ideas of the modern at the time in Shanghai. And what did that mean? You know, there was this idea in Shanghai that like for example, in the streets of Nanjing Road, where you had these department stores that, you know, whatever the West had, we in Asia also had the right to have. So we wanted everything that was sort of like fresh and new and advanced. But of course, there was a dark side to modernity as well. So here I explore slavery and the Omani Empire. We forget there was the Omanis actually ruled the Swahili coast, and their capital was in Zanzibar. And this particular section ends off with the horrors of World War II, a very different kind of modernity. How, you know, new forms of technology, new forms of governance added, you know, led to something that was very horrific. But then, you know, it closes with sort of the end of colonial empires and the emergence of nation states. Last section of containers and connectivity. Actually quite different from all the sections that came before, because I wanted to explore very specific contemporary themes. So the Singapore chapter, I looked at containerization and the airport. And the airport basically is just an extension of the port, right? It's air plus port. And but I also explore other themes such as questions of cultural tourism. I use Bali as the case study. Sustainability, like in Dubai here, cultural rejuvenation, the digital economy, and I end off this particular section and the entire book in Wuhan with the COVID-19 pandemic. I thought it was very important to sort of, you know, but I don't just explore the pandemic, I also talk a little bit about like travel and how pandemics have historically spread through travel in any case. So this isn't something new. So COVID-19, and I wanted to make sure that it ended in today. Now, the interesting thing also about this particular section is I think almost every chapter actually maps, kind of references a chapter in the first section. So you see that the entire book has a circular narrative. So the Singapore chapter kind of refers back to the Palembang chapter in part 1. So there's a sense again that you know there's a kind of a narrative, a circularity to the story that I'm telling. In the spirit of that, therefore, I end off with this slide. It is the Hondius map, a very important map that is actually the cover of the book. So we end off with the beginning of the book. And I hope that gives you a kind of overview of what the book actually covers. And I'll leave, I guess, more details of very specific subject areas to our discussion. Thank you so much.
You all hear me? Oh, okay. I can hear me, so that's quite good. Wow. I'm not sure there is a whole, you've covered a lot of the book, which is a marvelous read. I can't confess to have read every single word in it, but a great deal. an extremely entertaining read. So welcome everyone. It's good to have you here, and I hope you've enjoyed so far what you've heard. We're going to interrogate a little further some of the different chapters and themes that Kenny has worked on and studied and put into this written form. And when we are done with that, we will open the floor for discussion. So if you have any questions, you are more than welcome to ask them. Your book, Kenny, is, as you say, puts aside this silo approach, which is a great feature of academia, and advances the narrative in very broad themes that this, instead of a port by port exploration, even though you do that, I think you take very great pains to stress that we are looking at a networked area. And in so doing that, you had to wear a lot of hats. How challenging was that for you? Because we have Kenny the traveler, Kenny the wanderer, Kenny the historian, art historian, architecture observer, economist, foodie, and the list goes on and on.
I think the one thing that I enjoy doing in my time at the museum is to actually take guests through the museum and to tell stories based on an object. So to me, the different kind of things that I feature, so to speak, whether it's an object at the museum or a building or a dish or a particular kind of dress, they're all objects in my mind. And I guess it's the same technique of sort of using the object, so to speak, as a starting point to get into a larger story about you know, the life and the history of a particular place. It's I have to say that being able to write this book was actually a bit of a lifesaver because while I have to run a museum, I actually am very, very introverted. So I prefer to actually sit at my desk to write. Every morning, I remember I wake up at 7 to sort of write before I get into the museum. And it wasn't because of this sort of ability to sort of ground myself with you know, at my computer. I don't think I would be able to have I wouldn't have been able to get through the day. So this was actually a kind of solace for me, and a way to also pull together. As a museum director, you don't get much chance to be involved with the content. You actually have to raise money, so, and you know, do administrative work. So this became my sort of way to still engage the museum.
I think in the pantheon of, or the history of understanding narratives like this one, I think it's the book, The History of the World in 100 Objects, that really changed the way that we approach these narratives. Was it an influential book for you?
Yes, I do think that, and I actually know Neil McGregor.
Yes.
Of course, we've had, you know, we've been on sort of committees before, and I'm very inspired because he's such an amazing storyteller. I mean, I was inspired by it, but in some ways it wasn't an exact replica of that, because clearly not every chapter starts off with a museum object. But I think what's very important, I feel, is that oftentimes when a history book is written, and that's actually kind of like a pet peeve working at the museum in some ways, because there's a difference between being a historian and being at the museum, a curator or an art historian. A historian researches text, and you look at, you know, words on the page, whereas for curators, you use objects as your text. And then you have architectural historians that use architecture as a way to tell a story. So I thought that it would be actually really fun to try to approach you know, history through these sort of multiple dimensions, partly again because at the museum we have different kinds of objects. We have objects that are works of art, we have objects that are actually pieces of architecture, and we have objects that have to do with food. So being able to sort of approach history through these multiple angles was, I thought, the most fun bit of writing the book, but also what I think makes it quite distinctive.
So do you think Great Port Cities of Asia in History by Kennie Ting should be required reading at universities or a school textbook?
I wouldn't dare to say that. I just think that, again, I mentioned that I wrote the book as a kind of travel journal. And the risk of sounding very facetious is actually, I see myself more like a Frodo Baggins, like going through like a Lord of the Rings. I try to make it actually as entertaining and as whimsical as I could. And I mentioned that I had to cut out a lot of the book. I had to cut out some 30,000 words at least to make sure that the book was this size. And I didn't just cut out. So I remember my publisher was like, "It's not an academic book. You need to cut out all of the footnotes first. Footnotes had to go, etc." But also a lot of the more whimsical aspects of the book I had to cut.
Okay, you mentioned food had to go, but we will talk about food because this is Penang after all. So as we've discussed, the terms that keep coming up, the ideas that keep coming up relate to the material culture, what is found in the museums. But then we really do start out the book in an area which, as you said, you rely on archaeological sources to figure out what is happening. The first focus is on these very early centers of maritime trade that connect different ports, of which of interest to us would be Kedah. Then you have Eo and Nagapattinam. Can I ask that you pass me a copy of the book, please? So that Kenny can read an interesting passage, which is the very first one, which you talk about the discovery of a Buddha statue in the Bujang Valley. Would you read for us that chapter, please?
Oh no, that's not the recent one. So, so just some background. I wanted to begin the book with the Bujang Valley because it features one of my favorite pieces at the ACM. So when the British kind of did their excavations at the Bujang Valley in the 1930s, they brought the archaeological collections to Singapore, and they're with the ACM. So the Buddha that Bettina's refers to is on display at the ACM right now, and this is it. So let me just read this. In the permanent galleries of Singapore's Asian Civilizations Museum, there is a bronze figurine of the Buddha that hints at ancient maritime links between India and Southeast Asia. The figurine is small but exquisitely cast. The Buddha is depicted with hip gently arched to the right and right hand lowered to grant a blessing to pilgrims. He is barefoot and smiles serenely. The ends of his robe are draped gently over a raised left arm. His pose is relaxed, languid. His body is sculpted with a nod towards realism. One's immediate impression is that this is the work of an Indian master craftsman. So closely does the style of this bronze figurine recall that of Buddhist statues during the Gupta Empire, considered a golden age in Indian civilization. And indeed, the museum's own descriptions of the object note that the figurine most likely dates to sometime between the 5th to the 8th centuries. But they also note that the statue was found in today's Kedah state, to the north of the Malay Peninsula. In fact, scholars believe that the statue was made by a Southeast Asian artisan. And so this is quite important because it refers to the spread of Indian culture to Southeast Asia in sort of antiquity, probably around that time, the 4th to around the 8th century CE. And there were a few very important civilizations that we know of course, that have this sort of Gupta style in, and we have to refer to these archaeological artifacts, works of art there in the museum to be able to kind of deduce that. So the Kedah Bujang Valley was one of them. Akio is another one. And the chapter ends actually with another piece that's presently in the collection of the Musée Guimet in Paris. It is a sort of 7th century Phnom Da style statue of the Bodhisattva Avalokiteshvara. And the reason why I featured that as well is because we had that at the ACM too. When we did an exhibition on Angkor with the Musée Guimet in 2018, we brought that statue over It's a beautiful statue, again demonstrating the kind of centralness that would have had influence from Gupta, India. A third civilization that also had that influence, I was just there last week, was the Champa Empire, and I was just at Mison, the kind of the holy city of the Chams. So that's also a UNESCO World Heritage Site. It's kind of on par with Borobudur, with Angkor, etc. But a lot of it's been destroyed. But there were these sort of centers of civilizations here that demonstrate this kind of like transfer of culture from India more than a century ago, a millennia ago.
And in addition to the material culture, which I'll come back to, because it's clear that in the study, in your study, you're not really just limited to this region. You have to go all the way up there to pass through the Mediterranean and get into the European great collections and museums.
Yes.
In order to really solidify your understanding of what has been accomplished in port cities. But in addition to material culture, you also already alluded to a literary record. And you write especially of a Chinese contribution, accounts of traveling monks or pilgrims. What do they tell us about cities?
Most of the historical record in relation to these early Southeast Asian cities actually come from the Chinese. One of the monks, the wanderers that appear in the first section is the monk Yi Jing, and who travels to Kedah, and who travels to Srivijaya, and who reports back on the monks and the society and what's happening in these cities. Funan, for example, so Okyo is the now I guess regarded as the main port city of the Empire of Funan. Funan itself, the name itself comes from the Chinese record. There's no other, we don't know what the name is except from the Chinese record. So these early Chinese travelers were very important in terms of literary records for us in understanding what was going on at the time. So they're very, they complement the archaeological record.
What were those, when they wrote them, did they write them as diaries, journals, or were they written for other purposes?
No, they were written as rilas, basically. They were basically eyewitness accounts of what they saw at the time.
Okay, and then in addition to, your odd monk or pilgrim showing up here and there, you have the great embassies. You have the great armadas that sort of fuel the exchange of not just goods, but you start to see perhaps the diplomacy that is emerging in the region. And along with that, that interchange, you have the philosophy and thought and ideas that begin to come into play, because if you're a port city, you host people who are coming from other port cities. I have to say that one of the bits in the book that I really enjoyed, because I've never heard of it, is the Great Belly Guest House of Hakata. And as you wrote, that I am also guilty of associating Hakata only with ramen. But maybe if you can talk a little bit about this Great Belly Guest House, what's become of that site and why it's still, even especially today, considered important.
Yeah. So maybe just to take a step back, there were different kinds of systems of trade in Asia. So if the Indian Ocean was one that was kind of free and easy, laissez-faire, what you had in East Asia was actually very different. It was often, it was based, it wasn't trade per se, it was kind of tribute trade. So China set the tone, and Japan in some ways also followed that approach. And it's still kind of similar today. So you couldn't just trade with China. You had to offer tribute to the imperial courts, and then whatever's left behind, you trade it in the port cities of Guangzhou and so on and so forth. Because of the Confucian structures that were in place in East Asia, there was a general suspicion and disdain of trade. That was true of China and Japan as well for centuries. And so in Japan, At the time, the Korokan was a kind of diplomatic guest house. The Japanese didn't like foreigners, and they haven't liked foreigners in a very long time, even today, I dare say. And the idea was always to keep foreigners as far away as possible in the furthest most kind of like port city. This is what port cities were for, to keep away the foreigners. And so Hakata to Japan, and Japan is also very interesting because the story of Japan has always been how it's been kind of like resistant, but eventually absorbing new ways of thinking from the West. But at that time, during the Tang Dynasty, the 9th, the West was China. And most of the foreign kind of like interaction was with China or Korea. So in a typical kind of East Asian approach to trade, when foreign merchants, as in Chinese and Western, sorry, let's use that. Western merchants, as in Chinese and Korean merchants, came to Japan, you couldn't just go anywhere. You had to first, give up certain parts of your cargo as tribute to the courts, the royal courts, and then you were housed in this place called the Great Belly's Guest House, which was basically a kind of prison. You couldn't leave it. You had to be kept far away, and you were maybe were allowed to go out occasionally. Formally, perhaps you may be allowed to sort of present your tribute to the courts, but more or less, you had to stay where you were. And so that was the function. So I find it very interesting because today it's so important, and the Fukuoka government is sort of preserving it as a sense of Japan's sort of contact with the outside world. But actually, the purpose of that was in some ways to keep the outside world as far away as possible. Yes, because they refused to stop coming.
Right. So, you mentioned the Japanese get a lot of the influences coming from Tang China, but then you have dynastic changes happening in China as well. And at some point, trade, as opposed to being something that you keep in an isolated area so that it doesn't contaminate everyone else and traders stay there too, becomes more open. So how do these changes in government or bureaucracies or political thought influence the rise and fall of port cities?
It's through port cities that these new forms of government actually sort of are imported into the terrestrial sort of empire. So for example, again, we were talking about Japan. There were, actually in the history of Japan, there were basically two moments of change. The first was during this period in Tang China, where Japan sent embassies because they wanted to absorb and learn from China. So at that time, these sort of Tang Chinese ways of governance, ways of living, dress, everything, making tea, all of that was imported into Japan. And it remained for a while. The next time that there was a huge shift again in Japan was during the Meiji period, when America came with their gunboats, their black ships, and forced open Japan. And then, of course, then there was another wave of new types of government, new ways of seeing the world, new ways of living that were imported into Japan. And this is kind of similar, I would say, although sometimes this happens by force. Sometimes this happens more gradually for many other sort of empires in Asia, and port cities were the gateway for that happening. So if you look, say, at places like India, like Kerala, for example, when the merchants, the Muslim or the Jewish and the Christian merchants first came in the 6th and 9th centuries, they brought their faiths, they brought their ways of living and ways of thinking there, and it was through the port cities that these came through. Much old, like earlier we were talking about the ancient civilizations, the Hindu Buddhist faith, those forms of governance which we still have today. So, for example, the idea of the king and its relationship to the divine, etc., that came from India. And that also came through the port cities and influenced the kingdoms that were here.
Was there a sort of political Wallace line of sorts? Because it seems as if what we've just talked about, China being the west to Japan, that there's a line there, and on this side of it, you have like the Srivijaya mandala. Were there really sort of two quite different political systems, or am I reading too much into this?
I think that it wasn't political systems per se, I would say, but there were different ways of dealing with trade. So I mentioned the Indian Ocean world, it was very free and easy. And in East Asia, there was this sense of a hierarchy, and you had to have just kind of the idea of this tribute trade. Southeast Asia was always a kind of gateway. So whether it was Srivijaya, later on it would be Malacca, Aceh, today it's Singapore. Southeast Asia was a kind of choke point always for the trade eastward to China in particular and back. So it always functioned as a kind of like, it probably had to exert some kind of like Srivijaya probably exerted some kind of protection money or whatever. You know, you to pass through us, you had to offer some of your cargo in order to be able to go on to China. So the different kind of regions had a different way of dealing with trade.
Okay, which leads us very nicely into Malacca. There is a quote which you have in the book: "Men cannot estimate the worth of Malacca on account of its greatness and profit. Malacca is a city that was made for merchandise, fitter than any other in the world, the end of monsoons and the beginning of others. Malacca is surrounded and lies in the middle, and the trade and commerce between the different nations for 1,000 leagues on every hand must come to Malacca. Whoever is Lord of Malacca has his hand on the throat of Venice." I mean, this is one of the most powerful statements about Malacca, which I think if you go to Malacca today, you don't actually kind of get a sense that it was anything quite like that. I think the question that I think most people know the story of Malacca and why the Portuguese and the Dutch and the British all came, and it was a very important point for them. I suppose where what I see when I'm looking at Malacca in its history is that there are events happening thousands and thousands of miles away that have great impact in this region that we don't really see until they become history. We're looking at events happening in Lisbon and in Rotterdam and in London.
Yeah, and you're absolutely right. And I think one of the things I tried to do in part 2, which is my favorite part, which ends off in Malacca, is to also provide a sense of how it's chaos theory. The butterflies flaps its wings and something else is impacted here. How Malacca's fate was sort of intimately linked to other things that were happening. So the point where so that particular quote is very famous, by the Portuguese kind of apothecary Tome Pires, and he actually wrote it on hindsight. It was already in Malacca, and in a way, it was meant for him to kind of justify why the Portuguese had to take over Malacca. But it was also an eyewitness account of how bustling Malacca was at the time. So I end off the Malacca chapter, end that whole section with the Portuguese coming. But a lot of things happened before that. So when Malacca came to be, it was actually trying to protect itself. It had to survive, and was trying to protect itself from attack by Ayutthaya, by the Siamese. And in order to sort of protect itself from the Siamese, it had to try to secure a sort of most favored vassal nation sort of status from China, from Ming China. And that is one of the reasons why when Cheng Ho came, there was always the Malaccan kings would travel would send embassies frequently to China, and for a while, and this is actually in the Chinese record as well. So once they managed to secure that protection, they were able to fend off Ayutthaya. But when China midway through that turned its back against the world again. After the Yongle emperor died, suddenly they weren't interested in trade anymore. You didn't get the Cheng Ho coming through anymore. So Malacca needed another strategy. And that's when they decided the king decided to convert to Islam. because the much of the Indian Ocean world at the time was already the trade and commerce was in the hands of the great Islamic empires, the Ottomans and so on. And Malacca wasn't the first of these Islamic sort of polity in Southeast Asia that was in Pasai in Sumatra. But in some ways, it was therefore very tactical and strategic to be able to sort of, put itself into this larger kind of network of Muslim trade and commerce, which then actually allowed Malacca to thrive because it then became this sort of endpoint. So I mentioned there was a triumvirate of these very important port cities at the time, Cambay in Gujarat. And there's a historical record that one of the largest communities of traders in Malacca were the Gujaratis, the Gujarati traders from Cambay, and Aden, midpoint. And so Malacca, because it was part of this triumvirate, became exceptionally wealthy and exceptionally important in trade.
It's one of those things where even today you look at whether you're going to trade with another country or not, you are looking for stability, you are looking for conditions under which you can come and go about your business and not have to worry about what is happening. And yet, the great innovations, the great new ideas come with chaos. Is that something that you've noticed in all of, I mean, the idea, the sort of political alliances and the strange bedfellows that Malacca makes are an example of that. But have you seen that elsewhere in the port cities?
I think that port cities are where encounter takes place. And it's not always, I mean, sometimes it's chaos and conflict, but sometimes it's actually, I mean, I'd like to think that, because I would say that if chaos and a slightly more forceful way of kind of introducing new ways of thinking, new forms of governance, that came with colonialism. But before all of that, a lot of the change was actually more gradual. So again, if you look at the port cities of the south, the former Malabar coast, so like Kerala, Kochi, and so on, the influence was a lot more gradual. So if the change came with merchants, it was always peaceful. And then there was that process, much more gradual and peaceful process of assimilation, so to speak. So new ways, new faiths, new cultures, new foods, etc. came and was more gradually kind of assimilated. So it wasn't, I think it's quite balanced. It wasn't, a lot of it came through conflict and through sort of, colonialism, but there was a lot that came also gradually through trade. Yeah.
And then, of course, when you talk about the peaceful influences through trade, we then come to a period in history in which it is not peaceful, as you say, and you have colonialism, which again is a subject that is very widely read by a lot of people. It's not something that I want to spend a huge amount of time on, because there is a great deal in this book. But one thing that I do want to ask you is one of the joys of researching anything is interrogating the subject through all the different ways it expresses itself. Can you talk a little bit about language? You know, especially these bridge languages we know, we learned as lingua franca in port cities and among people who don't share a language. How does language impact the port city?
Yeah, language is actually quite a I thought was one of the most interesting things for me in writing this particular book. And actually one of the biggest tussles I had with my editor was on language, if I had my way, because, this is a multilingual sort of milieu. And I actually had a lot more words in multiple languages in there. So in Chinese, of course, in Japanese, in Gujarati, in whatever, Tamil, etc., Arabic. Every time I had a kind of word that was not English, I actually had the non-English word in it, and all that was meticulously cut out, which is very, very painful. So I thought that was important because I wanted to give everyone a sense of just how rich that linguistic kind of landscape was, and you still get a little bit of it in the book. So I insisted that every port city's name would also have its sort of name in its original language. But of course, with all these sorts of many languages, there are these tongues that these sort of hybrid tongues or lingua franca that emerge as well, and you see that development through time. So very early on, what was spoken was probably a kind of Persian Creole in the early. And we know this also because if you look at some of the terms that persist today in related to the maritime in Malay or in Arabic or in Persian, they have a Persian or Malay root. So Shah Bandar and Shah Bandar, for example, Bandar is port, but also means city in Malay, and Shah Bandar is the port, the captain of the port. Nakhoda, which means a ship captain or ship owner, that recurs in many of the Indian Ocean languages, from Malay all the way to Swahili. And so you know that there was probably a kind of Persian Arab Creole that was being spoken that eventually became, at some point also when the Portuguese came, it became Malay. Malay was a lingua franca of trade at a certain point. And then it became like Pidgin English. And so there's a section in the book where I actually sort of highlight a kind of Pidgin English ditty that emerged. And many of the languages we speak today, like Singlish or Manglish, are also a kind of lingua franca, mixing of because through trade we needed to find an easy way to communicate to each other. So we just borrowed things from all of our languages and created something new.
Just an aside to this wider discussion, you actually make quite a few references to place names in Hokkien in the book. Yes. Why is that, and why Hokkien?
Yeah, especially in the early chapters, because so many of the early names, or so much of the historical record was in Chinese, in the Tang or earlier dynasties, and we know that you didn't speak Mandarin in the Tang, so what was spoken, the spoken Chinese in the Tang dynasty is closer to Hokkien or Cantonese today, because during the Song and the Yuan, the Chinese sort of had to flee south. So a lot of what the Chinese would have sounded like at the time would be closer to Hokkien. So for example, like Srivijaya, if you read the Chinese word in Mandarin, it'd be Shi Li Fo Shi, which doesn't sound anything like Srivijaya. But if you read it in Hokkien, it's like Xia Lai Fu Cua, which sounds a bit more like Srivijaya. So I think I'm not the first person to suggest this, but if you kind of read it in the Hokkien, it suggests that perhaps these names that in Chinese were actually transliterations of the original names of these places.
So in the in the writing of the book, in the research, what have you come to settle on around the issue of identity? And I know you've mentioned that nation states come up at a certain point, but how do you then look at identity in this region?
This is very, I don't know if this is like a politically correct thing to say, but I'm definitely more for port city identity than nation state identity. I do think that, in my view, identity is a journey. It's always in flux. And oftentimes, I think, if you read the book, so for example, if you look at the Cheongsam, the Qipao, it's seen as something that's very quintessentially Chinese, but actually it has influence from, there's European tailoring, and it comes originally from the Manchu dress. And so I think in a way, the point that I make is that identity is always in flux. It changes, and it's fine. It's good to sort of say that there is a certain kind of identity that makes sense for right now, but it's not something that's monolithic. I think we have to be able to explore what aspects of our identities come from elsewhere, and even if they're sort of difficult parts of identity. So for example, like our colonial past, like it or not, you can't avoid it. It's sometimes as deeply ingrained as the fact that we're speaking English here.
Yes.
So how, therefore, do you I like to think that a good way to think about it is what kinds of new creative expressions, what kind of new ways of living, what kinds of new kinds of food, etc., emerge from this particular contact. And like I said, again, contact can be through conflict, could be painful, or it could be through trade, which is a lot smoother. But the fact is that there is new forms of creative expression that are hybrid that eventually become part of our national identity. So I think it's fascinating to dive deep into these sort of hybrid roots of our national identity and to celebrate this hybridity.
Which is a very good point to ask you to read once again from the book, because this is for all the foodies in the audience. This is the thing about the banh mi, which I think is also very interesting.
The sad thing about the book is that quite a lot of the sections on food I had to cut out because it just, I had to cut so many words out. So, sometimes it just didn't make sense to include these. And a lot of the sections had to be condensed as well. So this section was a lot longer. But
on the other side, you now have a great deal of material for your next book, which is the food of the port cities of Asia.
And I thought this really was an interesting way in which a particular city and a particular country actually sort of assimilated and recolonized in some ways their colonial past. So this is about banh mi, right? So this is from the Bangkok and Ho Chi Minh City chapter, and it's the end of the chapter. And this is a section that's set in Saigon. So cutting a straight and unwavering line through the center of the city to the banks of the river was Rue Catina, the pulsing heart of Saigon-ville. It's l'Avenue des Champs-Élysées. Most of Saigon's stupendous monuments were to be found on or not far from Rue Catina, including the aforementioned, as well as the headquarters of the Banque de l'Indochine, the French colonial bank par excellence, the French Cercle Sportif, its equivalent to the British Gentlemen's Club, and the Governor's Palace, its center of political power. The street was also a commercial thoroughfare, host to the city's foremost departmental stores and boutiques, and the city's most posh address, with luxurious residential apartments, grand colonial hotels, and high-end cafes and grocery stores. Two of the most famous hotels, the French-built and managed Hotel Continental and the Chinese-built Hotel Majestic, were to be found within a stone's throw of each other and seethed with diplomats, dignitaries, and spies during the Vietnam War period. English novelist Graham Greene's best-selling 1955 work, The Quiet American, was set in Saigon and had many of its scenes play out in the Hotel Continental. Much later in the 1950s, immediately after the French left the city, Rue Catina and other streets would become the birthplace of banh mi, Saigon's most iconic dish and culinary export. Essentially a Vietnamese-style meat sandwich, banh mi is a hybrid dish that had its origins in the French-style baguettes, once only sold in the city's high-end delis. Banh mi refers to both, quote-unquote, bread made with wheat, as well as the sandwich itself. It originated as street food hastily put together along street intersections by enterprising and itinerant hawkers pushing humble food trucks. It is thus a far cry from the chic baguettes to be had in the city's former cafes, and its very existence is a form of popular resistance. While the French were still in town, they objected to the Vietnamese experimenting with Gallic cuisine, which they regarded as far superior to Vietnamese food. Once the French were gone, however, the Vietnamese democratized the baguette, making it far more affordable and much better suited to the complex and refined Vietnamese palate.
Wonderful. Wonderful. I mean, in many, as you mentioned, the fact that we're having this discussion here in English, you wrote the book in English, we're all still consumers in a way of colonialism. I'm going to do a little poll. I'm going to ask a question, and if you, the answer to it for you is a yes, please raise your hand and keep your hand there. Okay, we'll see what happens. Who has been to Bali? Okay. Keep your hand, wow, keep your hands up. When you were in Bali, keep your hand up if you attended a kachak performance. Who knows that the kachak was invented by a German man called Walter Spies? Who knows that Bali as a tourist destination is entirely a Dutch invention? There we go. But I mean, this is bringing us into really what is the role of port cities of Asia today? And the tourism is a very big part of that. Can you speak a little on that?
Yeah, so I'm glad we are going into the last section of the book.
Yes.
I actually really enjoyed writing that section because every single chapter actually deals with a very specific subject that also has its discontents. Obviously, tourism is one of them. And in many cases, tourism is manufactured. I mean, it's something that took place during the colonial period that was kind of continued on when, as an economic strategy, when the nation state emerged. But oftentimes also, I mean, these days, there's always this kind of there's always sort of this hubris in tourism, because you have this sort of tourism and it seemed good. And then you get to this point of over-tourism, and then you have these questions of sustainability, not just in terms of environmental sustainability, but questions of authenticity. I mean, I'm sure you have these questions here as well in Penang. After you have the UNESCO designation, there's this question of how do you kind of preserve what is authentic and what is the heritage here, while still trying to ensure that there is this kind of the economic benefit that comes along. So the Bali chapter is a kind of example of where I would say it has gone kind of spectacularly wrong, and they're still grappling with this idea of like, have we gone too far? And I end off that chapter actually with a turn towards kind of like the spiritual, where where I encourage a visitor to, like, if you want to find the source of what Bali used to be hundreds of years ago, you go to the Besaki temple, and you have to find also in some ways that the source of authenticity within the Balinese people themselves. So I mean, there's no answer to this, because none of the issues that I bring up in the last section have any answers to them. These are issues that we're grappling with right now, and many of these sort of port cities or cities that are open to travel and trade are at the front line of these questions of cultural tourism and sustainability, and how do you other issues like rejuvenating cities that may have sort of declined, and so on and so forth.
I think the last bit is especially interesting, because you also in the book look at Dubai and Kaohsiung and Busan, and with all three, Korea, South Korea and Dubai, these are incredibly interesting because they really only have existed in their form the last 40 years or so. So what is happening there is really they're trying to manufacture a sense of place. I went to Dubai in 1994. The famous Sheikh Zayed Road, which is now 14 lanes, was two. Dual carriageway, 2 lanes in each direction. The tallest glass-fronted building was all of 5 stories tall. It is entirely different.
I remember that.
Yeah. Well, we're both showing our age. But I also remember there were still dhows that came in. And now what they've had to do to recreate this sense of Dubai being a port city is entirely manufacture a whole new harbor with some fake dhows in there. The sense of a patina of a place is something that all the travelers are looking for, but the cities realize that, but there seems to be in many of them a slip into something else before realizing that they need to come back to who they are.
So again, I when I was writing this, my editor again advised that I can't be too opinionated. So I actually cut out a lot of tracks also where I'm actually commenting on issues of sustainability. She said that you can't do that. So I took out a lot of those sections. But I'm clearly, like in the Dubai chapter, I'm clearly suggesting that that's not the way to go. And in most of the chapters of the last section, I end off with trying to find what is authentic about the city and what remains. And so in the Dubai chapter, for example, we end off in this area with the bargil, which are the wind towers. This historical section. Of course, it's been again restored beyond recognition. It's become like a
Disney-fied?
yeah, Disney-fied. But it's very interesting because the Bargil are a reference to the historic Persian community. Because it's called Persian Gulf for a reason, even though the Arab world doesn't like it being called the Persian Gulf. But once everyone who was plying the Gulf, whether they were Persian or Arab or whoever, were just called Khaliji. Khalij is the Gulf, the Khalij communities. And there was until recently, there was a lot more movement. So I wanted to allude to that in the Dubai chapter. There's a little bit of that still happening, actually. So Dubai is still the favorite place for business for the Iranians because they can't, because of whatever's happening in Iran. Even right now today, you still see that Iranian influence, even though that's not something that the Arab world likes as well. So, for example, this particular precinct, which used to which has the city's kind of Persian heritage, is no longer called that. There's just a generic name. So it doesn't refer to these foreigners anymore. The foreigners there are called the Ajami. But I feel like I felt it's very important to remind readers of that heritage so that it doesn't get forgotten. So the chapter, most of the chapters in that section end off with something that is very small and very quiet, but I hope is a seed of authenticity within everything else that happens.
And definitely plenty food for thought, which I hope this discussion has given you. Again, marvelous read, the book, very entertaining. You'll learn lots of new little things, as I did. Are there any questions from the audience, please? We have one over here.
Oh, thank you.
Oh, you've got the microphone. Jessica, go ahead.
Yes, is that all right?
Yes.
Ah, lovely. Thank you for a splendid talk tonight. Thank you, Bettina. Thank you, Kenny. I was quite mystified by how you chose your final ports. You were kind enough to indicate that earlier that you could almost flip through to start at whatever chapter or whatever port you wanted. But in your own mind, I was curious how you might have formulated it.
The final ports in the last section, or all?
Just when you were thinking about the book, and I know you said you were kind of promulgating your wanderer, traveler type spirit. Yeah. But in the end, to compile it with just these, and then to conclude it, I wonder how you pulled it all together.
Yeah. A lot of it was actually related to the themes that I wanted to explore in each section. And this is actually a good question because I planned I mapped out the entire journey in great detail, so I knew which ports I wanted and the subtitles before I started writing. So if the first section, for example, because I knew it had to be archaeology driven, I just went so the Tang shipwreck was a starting point. So that meant Basra and Palembang Sriwijaya and Yangzhou. Yangzhou was actually something that I came to because there were some cities that I had to decide where to put. So Guangzhou was one of them. Do I put Guangzhou with the Tang shipwreck up front, or do I put it later on where I address the Canton system and the Opium War? I decided to put it later on. So based on the themes that I wanted to explore in each section, I landed on the ports. But I also consulted some of the academics and some of our board members. So the good thing about being in a museum is that when I write to them, they respond as the director of the museum. So before I started IELTS and before COVID, when COVID kind of ended, when we could do like 2 people lunches and whatever, I reached out and I also met with and sought advice from many the academics and some of my board members, and I asked them questions. How do you think I should approach this? What do you think are some of the port cities that I should include? That's how I landed with this particular group. But there were some cities you knew had to be in there because they were obvious. But because I really wanted to make sure, for example, in the colonial period, it wasn't just the usual suspects like Manila, etc. I tried to find these other port cities that were equally important.
Thank you. First of all, congratulations on what you've achieved in Singapore with the Peranakan Museum and the Museum of Asian Culture.
Thank you.
Brilliant places. I mean, in the time that we were living there, the Asian Culture Museum has changed beyond belief. It's terrific. But my question is, of all this research you've been doing with, you're embedded in the detail, was there any aspect of the ports that really surprised you? You didn't really believe that this was a historical fact?
There's probably a lot of that. I can't remember in detail. I think that the most meaningful part of the research was when I tried to hunt down these other ports that were not the obvious ones. So, like, for example, I really enjoyed writing the Aceh and Makassar chapter because I didn't know anything about it. You just don't know. I mean, I think sometimes, I think the one thing about many of some of these port cities is that the image you have of them today is very different than how they were. Let's talk about Aden. Today it's just this war. But then, when you read about what it was at the time, it was this cosmopolitan place. So I think to me, these other port cities, these like Aceh, Makassar, understanding that sense of agency, Aceh and the story of its queens. I mean, like, who knew? I had no idea. But realizing that there were these moments in time, there was these kinds of exceptions in the usual kinds of histories that you would learn when you did your Southeast Asian studies, etc. in school. That was the best part. And there were many of these. I really tried to sort of hunt down these little nuggets of information. And the Makassar chapter, I looked at the histories of the Bugis, and most people don't know that the Bugis weren't always seafarers. They were actually land-based. It was the Dutch that drove them out to the sea. And then they became the greatest seafarers on earth. Actually, there was one very interesting thing that I learned, which was this idea of kingship and the negeri in the Malay world, where it's in the body of the king. It moves around. There was something fascinating for me because it's not linked in any way to the soil. It's kind of like where the king is, there is the city or the.
And isn't that expressed with that particular scepter, with an alam standard? Yeah, there's an alam standard. So where that is, there very often I have heard that in order to take over this community, this region, you had to get the standard because nobody would pay homage to you if you didn't have the standard. Any more questions? Yes.
Good evening. Thank you for a very stimulating conversation. The question I would like to ask is a business question. It relates to the Kral Isthmus Canal. Now, I believe this is a narrative that has prevailed for over 300 years, starting from King Narai of Siam. And there are layers of intrigues concerning this project. We talk about ports, but I think what's important is to understand the conveyance of interports. And the canal is important because it traverses trade routes from the Andaman Sea to the South China Sea. And the question I would like to ask is, since it's a 300-year narrative, did you glean anything from your research from this particular section? Because to me it seems strange because it is not something that is discussed widely, but it has dramatic and far geo-economic and also military ramifications. not only in Southeast Asia, but I would say throughout the region. Thank you so much.
I have two ways to answer this very difficult question. The first is that, if you look at the Bujang Valley chapter at the very beginning, the Bujang Valley and Akio chapter, you would see that actually there was, the cargo would come and it would be dock off at Kedah, and you would just go overland to the other side, which is probably Langkasuka, and then you went off. The ships would then take cargo. So there was there was no need for a canal, you just went overland. Because the main entrepot at the time was in Kedah, the Bujang Valley. And so the cargo was taken overland across the isthmus to the port on the other side. And then it went on north to Akio and onwards to China. So I think that what's more interesting to me is this emergence and the shift of the most important entrepot port along the Malacca Straits. So you see, we start off with it's the Malay world basically. This whole the Alam Melayu. There's always an important entrepot port. So we start off with Kedah, and then there's Sriwijaya, there's Palembang, which is still in the sort of the larger Alam Melayu, and then there's Malacca, and then for a while it goes to Aceh, and now it's Singapore. Who knows in a few hundred years where will be that next entrepot? But there's always been an entrepot, and this entrepot has always needed to exist in relation to the trade with the East in China, and it shifts based on what the geopolitics, etc. I think that's more interesting. So I don't know if somehow the more important entrepot shifts north, and then maybe that would be a canal. But if you look at it, I guess it's very difficult to answer these questions. But if you look at it in a long durée, I think you will see that it's possible in the future that if there's a more important kind of entrepreneur up north, that might happen. But it's never been necessarily. Trade was still happening across what would have been a canal 1,000 over years ago.
I think if maybe they unchoke the rivers, you actually already have a canal. I think there was quite a lot of trade that went into the hinterland through these great rivers. Sungai Muda, for instance, was one of them, and up in Canton there were rivers as well. But they're all choked up now because we're very badly behaved people.
Yeah, the rivers were very important.
So the rivers would have been that. Would you like us to wrap, Fawaz?
I also have a few questions.
Oh, right. Oh, my goodness. Have we been live all this time? Hello, everyone on Facebook.
Oh, dear, I would have been a bit more careful.
Had no idea. I would have shaved my legs. Right. Oh, thank you. Yes, Fawaz, what are the questions from Facebook?
We have about 7 people registered and about 50 present persons, so I'm assuming that there are about 20 people watching. There are about 3 questions, but 2 of them can be quickly answered as to yes or no, and also some names. Sorry. Okay, Ray McWilliams is asking, can you please verify whether Penang was originally called Pulau Kasatu by a sailor named Nakoda Raga? That's the first question. Just verify whether it's true or not. The second question is, what was Penang called by the Ming Dynasty Admiral Cheng Ho? Should I break the other questions, or should I?
No, we'll do this one
I'm
first.
just going to respond to it. I have no idea because Penang appears in the later parts of my book during the chapter 5 on modernity. So I don't dabble in the much earlier histories of.
I've read histories that it was called Pulau Kasatu because that's kind of the first island that you encounter. That's what I've heard by the person you mentioned. No idea. Anybody in the audience know? No. Next.
The next 2 questions to me are quite interesting. It actually comes from 2 different people on Facebook. The first one is asking, okay, so he says, historical records of foreign groups visiting Malaya point to sea travel. Any record of such visit via land route, which would be from the north, Now, I find that interesting because the second question after that is, moderator has commented that historical roles, for example, of port cities, typically become apparent only from a future vantage point. Will the subsequent flourishing of air cargo travel and now the terrestrial international Belt and Road initiatives relativize the significance of port cities? Now, I just want to add my kind of comment or question to it. I find it very interesting because over the past few years with COVID, I've seen these towns die. Like worlds are now extinct. Lives are no more. I mean, lives that I knew of as a child are now no more. So perhaps does this point to port cities also becoming extinct and land going back to land travel, for example, before air travel monopolizes, might go back to land travel?
I think actually, if we go down the route of being strictly sort of avoiding being too unsustainable and sort of having affecting the carbon amounts in the air, it's more likely that air travel disappears. I think sea travel will continue. It'll just take a longer time. I think sea travel will persist. Sea and land travel. Sea travel is still faster than land travel. I mean, during COVID, sea trade was still happening. It was the one thing that didn't get shut down. As for the decline and fall, I actually addressed this. So in the Kaohsiung and Busan chapter, I speak. The issue that I addressed was this cultural-led rejuvenation of industrial and port cities. So Kaohsiung and Busan were both examples of how, after the port kind of moved out, how they sort of rejuvenated themselves through culture. And certainly you have this also in other port cities like Liverpool and Bilbao. So the answer is yes, some port cities do disappear. I mean, again, look at places like Mocha. In my book, I addressed the port city of Mocha. There's nothing there today. But there's also the opportunity for some of these cities to rejuvenate themselves and become ports of another kind. My very last chapter, I also cheekily hint at us being, the city or all of us being sort of ports in the digital sense. We're all ports for ideas, and all of us in some ways are just kind of become ports.
I think just as a matter of interest, to follow up what you're saying, there is of course the conversion of what was a thriving port in its historical sense to something that is more touristy at the moment. But the one that I find really interesting is Sunda Kelapa, because you have a very modern port built elsewhere, but Sunda Kelapa still operates as a port for the intra-Indonesia trade. So you don't need to have something on a container port going from Jakarta to Surabaya, and road travel and road transportation is not that great. They still go by sea. I mean, for the longest time in Italy, all the trade was done by sea because there were no decent roads to speak of, and there were only donkeys that could cart your goods. So the sea, I think, remains a very viable form of transportation.
I think for our part of the world, for example, because a lot of history is again very terrestrial, but the fact is, historically, if you look at this region, the archipelago or peninsulas, the sea is more important. It's because the land is actually what's in between the water. And so, at least to me, that the focus on the water will persist. In fact, I find, even in Singapore as well, we don't even see ourselves very much as being, we're so removed from the port these days that we don't see the maritime aspects of the city. I don't know how it is in Penang here, but it seems like.
Did you have a question, or are you telling me to
Actually,
stop?
yes, I do have a question.
Yes.
So I find it intriguing when you talked about the port cities being agents of political change, of being political revolutions. But it raises the question whether have port cities ever became the centers of resistance against these changes.
So it's not so much political revolutions, but it is the gateways through which new forms of government and governance come into into play. And yes, of course. So like, you know, in the sections, particularly in section 4, like when I deal with the Aceh and the Makassar chapters, I speak about how, you know, there was the resistance against the Europeans. So the Achenese queens resisted the you know, the East European companies setting up actual physical sorts of factories in Aceh, because they saw what was going on elsewhere, like in Jakarta. So the minute you have the physical factories on land, that's it. Your kingdom is going to go in a while. So yeah.
If there are no more questions, I'm going to wrap because I think we've had an exhaustive and very entertaining discussion. I hope you've all enjoyed it tremendously. So could we please a big round of applause for our speaker, Kennie Ting.
Thank you, Bettina. Thank you so much.
And so if you have not purchased a book but would like to read a great deal, there are still some available here, and Kennie will be very kind to sign them for you. If you are headed out the door, I wish you all a very pleasant evening and a safe journey home. Thank you for coming to the Penang Institute this evening.
Thank you.
I had no idea we were being.
I know. I would have been a lot more careful what I'm saying.